30 minutes.
Good morning, Board of Directors at Tiki Toys. We'd like to take this opportunity to thank you for giving us the chance to share our insights and recommendations on the potential acquisition of Zanga Games. We would like to formally begin our presentation with a question. Should a company that makes toy trucks, doll houses, be the same company to make Call of Duty Modern Warfare? Now, in order to adequately address this question, we had to look at a number of others. For instance, what impact do violent video games have on our adolescents? What are the business, ethical, and legal considerations involved? And finally, what are the opportunities and risks that we should keep in mind throughout this process? Now, our team approached this problem from a very analytical framework. We started by examining the background information behind the violent video game issue, looking both at how the courts have viewed this issue, in addition to how society has formed its beliefs around violent video games. We next proceeded into analyzing this issue from an ethical perspective, looking at our company's strong values and seeing if this type of an acquisition can really meet those values. After that point, I will invite Jay up to the floor to talk about the business ramifications of this move. In his analysis, Jay looked at why the majority of mergers and acquisitions fall flat, and what characteristics, if any, separate this potential acquisition from the rest. After that point, we will invite Casey up to the floor to talk a bit at length about the legal ramifications, looking both at the domestic and international concerns. Tiki Toys, after all, is a global company, and we want to keep both of these types of concerns front of mind throughout this process. After that point, we will go over the salient features of our recommendation. Without further ado, let's talk about some background. The issue of whether violent video games lead to negative behaviors is a highly debated issue. And on that issue, through stringent research, we encountered two types of studies. The first type indicates a strong relationship between violent video games and negative behaviors. This type of study, such as a study created by the American Psychological Association, traditionally draws upon a wide array of psychological research studies and indicated two key insights. First, the vast majority of violent video games do not link negative consequences with negative in-game actions. So, what does this really mean? Imagine you're playing a game, such as Call of Duty, and you, as Rambo, the main character, are navigating a jungle. You encounter two soldiers. The first is armed to the teeth, poised to attack you, and you kill that soldier. The second, completely unarmed, waving a white flag vehemently in a clear sign of surrender, and you kill that soldier. Now, the game awards you with 1,000 points in both instances, despite the fact that your second action seems completely egregious, attacking a completely unarmed, surrendering soldier. The second key insight raised by this type of report relates to the issue of video game addiction. If violent video games tend to lead toward negative actions, think of addiction as a way of reinforcing these bad habits. A definitely concerning point for parents of our adolescents. However, these types of reports are not the only type out there. We also looked at studies which suggested a weak relationship between violent video games and negative behavior. Now, these types of studies, such as a Harvard study conducted a few years back, account for socioeconomic factors, such as household income, location of household, and we can account for these external underlying factors. Harvard found the relationship between violent video games and negative behavior drop dramatically. Now, these types of studies will also traditionally mention the benefits of video games, such as improved hand-eye coordination and better spatial reasoning. So video games definitely can provide some benefits. The courts have looked at both sides of the story and have by and large found information inconclusive. But just because the courts haven't reached an opinion on this issue does not mean that the public at large has failed to take a stand. Looking at public opinion polls, we learned that 2/3 of Americans believe that violent video games are a bigger safety threat than the guns depicted in them. Going off of that, we learned that over half of Americans believe that violent video games are leading to a more violent society. Now, imagine a room filled with 20 adolescents, ages 12 through 17. How many of them do you think are playing video games? Is it 10, 12? Research suggests that 97%, so 20 out of 20, everyone in our room has had exposure to video games, shedding some light onto the ubiquitous nature of this issue. The current administration is conducting stringent research on violence in entertainment, and we believe that from this research, we can begin to create a baseline for further recommendations and next steps. Now that we've taken a hard look at where this issue has been in the eyes of the courts and in the eyes of society, I would like to introduce Joseph to the floor, and he will identify if this acquisition can truly comply with our company's values.
Thank you, Sean. Okay, so if we're going to determine whether this complies with our company's values, the starting point would be what are our company's values. And of course, as the board of directors of Tiki Toys, you're aware of the mission through play to equip parents to foster growth and creative development. So we need to determine whether or not such an acquisition of Zanga Games would be in alignment with these values. And to do that, we propose two methods of analysis. First, being a method known as the 4 ethical avenues. And what this is, it touches on rights, interests, rights, duties, and virtues. And what this quite simply is just a formalization of long-standing historical approaches to ethical analysis. And being interests, the idea of maximizing satisfaction, rights being the idea of fairness and freedom. Two areas that are more toward the individualistic needs ends of things. Then you have duties being fidelity in community, speaking to something larger than oneself. And then finally you have virtues being quite simply something that looks to the character and culture of an organization and the individuals that organization serves, making sure that something actually contributes to that in a positive way. And the point in all this is to travel along these 4 avenues to arrive at a midpoint of moral insight, to understand a situation as, in terms of our values, how we can go about doing something in accord with our values. What is the ethical way of conducting things? And we're going to combine this with the stakeholder model that many of you are probably familiar with. And in the instance of Tiki Toys, how we view it, or the 5 key stakeholders of Tiki Toys would be the shareholders, of course. Then secondly, the employees. And then also our customers. And then for our younger customers, their parents are an important stakeholder. And then finally, the community at large. And the point here is to take these 2 approaches of the 4 ethical avenues and the stakeholder model, combine them, and look at a few principles, a few values that we see at stake in this potential acquisition. So first, just take a look at an idea of prudence, prudently considering opportunities and risks to child development. Now this is something that touches right to the core of the whole reason for being for Tiki Toys. It's a company that exists to contribute to child development and earn profit in the process. And from the way we view this issue, we see this as touching primarily upon the interests of our customers, the parents, and the broader community to have healthy child development. And we see the potentials of video games to provide an opportunity, to add to our ability to deliver that by adding interactive products. Currently we have more old-fashioned toys that are wonderful, and we can have video game offerings that can contribute and complement to that in an interactive way. So there's the opportunity. But then also we have some risks. And here this can touch upon the virtues, especially the idea that we want to contribute to the character of our organization as well as the character of our customers. And here the risks, of course, are the dangers of leading to aggressive behavior or creating addiction. And we do believe that there are concrete ways we can address those concerns, not only to mitigate them, but to actually provide an exciting opportunity for Tiki Toys, and we'll get to that in a minute. Secondly, we have, still along the lines of prudence, opportunities and risks to the business. And here, we still look at, in terms of interests, but to our shareholders and our employees. And if we can determine that this is a strong business opportunity for Tiki Toys, then really that this is serving the interests of our shareholders and our employees to provide a stable return on their investment and a stable source of employment in looking at positive business opportunities. And also in terms of virtues, that we can contribute to the character of an organization that employees can be proud to work at. Next, we want to look at an idea of respect. And firstly, this touches upon an idea of consumer freedom. And here we have the rights of consumers. First and foremost, as we think in a free market society, the freedom of choice, the freedom of consumers to make intelligent, informed choices of what products they wish to buy. And we can respect that right while remaining within our values. But also, there's a flip side to looking at freedom, and that is freedom from addiction. And being that that is a concern within the realm of video games, that we want to make sure we can concretely address the issue of addictiveness in video games so that we do not hinder the freedom of our consumers by making them addicted to a product. Now, finally, we have, still under the idea of respect, the idea of parental authority. And this, again, is touching upon the rights aspect and the role of parents to direct the upbringing of their children, that they have that right to be respected by companies, to not be undermined in their parental authority. And we want to make sure that we stay in accord with our values in our products that we offer, so that we are actually helping parents, equipping parents to foster growth and creative development. And really that also touches upon a duty that we have to parents and to the community at large, that we address such concerns as addiction. So as we look at these two ideas of prudence and respect, and our goal being to travel along these four avenues of analysis of interest, rights, duties, and virtues, we can arrive at a moral insight that, to our mind, actually presents not only an opportunity to be in accord with our company's values, but an opportunity to promote our company's values in a new industry. And currently, the video game industry is not adequately addressing the two primary concerns of aggression and addiction. And this presents a tremendous opportunity for us to enter into that industry and provide ethical leadership in a new industry by concretely addressing these two concerns. And how we propose, firstly, addressing the issue of aggressive behavior is looking at this concern over the tie between negative consequences and negative actions in games. So as we were talking about with Rambo taking out the soldier flying the white flag. And we want to look at the existing software of video games that Zynga Games currently markets and look for ways that we can rewrite the software of those games to make that connection between making a negative choice in a game and a negative consequence to reflect real life. And there may be games, of course, that are not suitable to rewrite. If we think, for example, of Grand Theft Auto, some of you might have heard of, and the whole premise of that game is to steal a car and deliver drugs to a drug dealer. That's really beyond redemption for a company such as Tiki Toys. So we would recommend divesting those games immediately. There's simply no way to make that in accord with Tiki Toys' values. And secondly, addressing the idea of addiction. Now here, the fundamental problem with addiction in video games is that there's not good data out there of what leads to addiction in video games. So what we propose doing is something that currently video game makers aren't really doing. And that is actually opening our doors wide to get our software developers to collaborate with psychological researchers, to analyze elements of the game such as lighting or incentives within the game or something, to find what actually causes addiction in video games and what we can do to potentially mitigate these concerns. And so, looking at this moral insight of this tremendous opportunity to provide ethical industry leadership, we see that not only is this move something that can be in accord with the values of Tiki Toys, but it in fact presents a tremendous opportunity to promote the values of a company like Tiki Toys into an industry that desperately needs that kind of ethical leadership. So we look once again at our mission statement, through play to equip parents to foster growth and creative development. And we can see in fact that this acquisition presents an ethical opportunity for the company. But of course, if it presents an ethical opportunity, the next questions we have to ask is, does it present a financial opportunity? And what are the legal considerations? So to answer those questions, first I'm going to turn it over to Jay and talk about the business.
Thanks, Joe. Board members, now that you've had a chance to listen to our ethical analysis, I'd like to walk you through our business analysis utilizing the SWOT method, which looks at the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats that this acquisition presents for us. To begin with, on the strength side, we asked ourselves, how can we maximize shareholder wealth? And we looked at it from two perspectives. How can we increase our revenue? And how can we increase those revenues to be healthy revenues, higher margins? And so we began by looking at it from an international perspective. In the last 5 years, we've seen our share of revenues go from about 0% globally to 5%. Similarly, based on our data, we've seen Zynga's growth from about 0% to 15%. And we feel that this trend will continue as emerging markets develop and we see a higher demand for software. And we see this acquisition as presenting synergies between our company and Zynga that gives us the opportunity to grab a larger share of the international market. Next, we looked at the global market. Next, we looked at the market size domestically. The toy industry making up about $2.7 billion versus a $34.2 billion market for the electronic gaming industry. Again, this acquisition gives us a chance to participate in the larger pie that's out there. Next, we looked at the growth perspective. According to Ibecc World, between 2012 and 2017, the toy industry is expected to grow at about a 0.3% rate versus a 5.5% growth rate for the electronic gaming industry. Again, we see the synergies as an opportunity for us to not only increase our revenues, but also increase the margins of our revenues. Lastly, we looked at the life cycle of our industry. We're in the physical toy industry right now, and as we've seen a change in trend from kids utilizing Lego toys to more the iPads and such for their entertainment and learning opportunities, we see that this acquisition gives us the opportunity to emerge from a mature market to a young emerging market that gives us the opportunity to become a growth company. Moving on to the weakness aspect, we looked at the social impacts of aggression and addiction, which Joe touched upon a little bit, and we'll get into a little bit more detail later on in the presentation. Next, we looked at the challenges of merging cultures and companies. According to a KPMG study, about half of mergers and acquisitions want to destroy shareholder wealth, with another further third creating no value at all in the long run. Next, we must realize that this acquisition is a competency outside of our core focus. As such, we may need to invest in certain management skill sets to make this acquisition a success. Now, keeping these three points in mind, we feel that Tiki Toys has the management structure that can make this acquisition a successful, realizing that we must do certain things differently to be successful. Next, we looked at the opportunities that this presents for us. I briefly touched upon the healthier types of revenue, which is what the video game industry brings. The toy industry has about a 4% margin versus a 20% margin rate for the video games. In addition, this acquisition also gives us the opportunity to complement our existing product lines and expand into new market segments, such as young children's video games, either utilizing our existing products or creating new product lines, and the entrance into the adolescent and young adult video games. In addition, as Joe touched upon, it gives us the opportunity to become the industry's ethical leader in terms of aggression and addiction. Next, we looked at the threats that this presents for us, pertaining to regulation both present and future, which Casey will touch upon, and association with tragic events. In the instance of both Columbine and Sandy Hook, the individuals that were involved were known to be highly addicted to violent video games, and we've seen the impact that it has had with the gaming companies that they were associated with. Next, we must realize that the technology changes rapidly and significantly in this industry. As such, R&D will become a focus for our key success. Now, similarly, going back to the weaknesses that we presented earlier, we feel that we have the management in place, and there are certain other proactive actions that we can take to mitigate these risks associated. At this time, I'd like to open it up for Casey to present our legal findings.
Thank you, Jay. And thank you again, board, for meeting with us today. Now that Sean has taken us through some of the issues surrounding violent video games, and Joe has shown us how the acquisition of Zynga Games by Tiki Toys could be an ethical decision, while Jay has shown us why it makes good business sense, I will go through our legal analysis before moving into our recommendations. Now, our recommendations have been touched upon by Sean, Joe, and Jay, but I'll bring them together and explain them more fully. Now, first, I want to talk about the Supreme Court case that we were given to analyze for this presentation. Brown versus Entertainment Merchants Association involves a California law that bans the sale of violent video games to youths under 18. Now, the Supreme Court found that this law was unconstitutional and that the state of California did not have a compelling state interest in enforcing the law as it was written. However, the Supreme Court has left open the opportunity for more narrowly tailored regulation. So what this means is that if this California law was written to be more narrow, that it could be upheld as constitutional. Now, there's also the possibility of future congressional regulation, which the Supreme Court would be more likely to defer to. The Supreme Court also offered up a caution in Justice Alito's concurrence, saying essentially that with the increase in video game technology, video games may become less and less entertainment and more of a behavioral assimilation. So video games may lose some of the constitutional protections that they currently have. Now, Zynga Games not only distributes domestically, it distributes internationally as well. And so we did touch upon some of the international considerations. As you can see from this chart, the United States is more liberal than many other countries when it comes to distributing video games. There are another number of reasons of why video games have been censored or banned in other countries. However, as Joe talked about, we recommend tying negative consequences to negative behaviors within Zynga Games, which would allow us to move into these markets that other countries may not, or other companies may not be able to move into. Now, other international considerations are first intellectual property. It is more difficult to protect the copyrights and trademarks of video games than it is to protect the intellectual property of physical toys. And this is especially true abroad. And so Zynga Games must make sure to add additional protections onto their international distributions. There are also additional costs, such as the cost of working with foreign entities, import and export costs, and possible new distributor contracts. Tiki Toys may not be able to use its current international distributors for these video games. So with these business, ethical, and legal analyses in mind, I'll move on to our recommendations. Our key recommendations are first to acquire Zynga Games as a wholly owned subsidiary. We also recommend that within Tiki Toys, you create a kids video game division. On top of these recommendations, we also recommend demonstrating ethical industry leadership through addressing the issues of aggression and addiction, which Jay will touch upon later. But first I want to go through the structure of the acquisition. Our company, Tiki Toys, would be the parent company. Within Tiki Toys, we recommend creating a kids video game division, creating video games rated early childhood, everyone, and everyone 10 plus, which is in line with our current toy offerings. We also recommend acquiring Zynga Games as a wholly owned subsidiary, creating video games rated teen, mature, and adult only. And we believe this acquisition has several benefits. The first being that Tiki Toys would be able to draw from Zynga Games' existing infrastructure and talent pool in order to create a strong market presence in kids' video games. There's also the issue of branding, in that Tiki Toys and Zynga Games both already have established brands and market presence. By acquiring Zynga Games as a wholly owned subsidiary, both of these companies could retain their respective brands instead of trying to mesh these two seemingly very different companies together to come up with a cohesive marketing strategy. So their marketing and branding could stay as they are. And so with these recommendations in mind, I'm going to turn it over to Jay to talk about industry leadership.
Thanks, Casey. In addition to the advantages of creating a subsidiary, we also see two opportunities to become the industry leader, specifically pertaining to leadership on aggression. As we briefly mentioned before, by setting standards for acceptable game, such as negative behavior in game equaling negative consequences in the game, and either rewriting or divesting software titles that don't meet these criteria. Next, we propose doing certain things such as pursuing solutions to addiction in collaboration with psychological researchers to mitigate addictiveness and to develop resources to combat addiction to become the industry leader on addiction. We began our presentation by asking the question, should a toy manufacturer that makes dollhouses, toy trucks be the same one that manufactures and distributes Call of Duty Modern Warfare? Our answers are resounding yes. We feel that this acquisition gives us the opportunity to move into an emerging market and become the growth leader in this industry. We propose acquiring Zynga Games as a subsidiary, creating a kids electronic games division, and demonstrating industry leadership on aggression by setting standards and rewriting or divesting games and content that doesn't meet our criteria. Next, we propose developing content and leadership on addiction through research collaboration. We began our presentation with Sean presenting background research, looking at research that's been conducted that looked at violent video games, addiction, and aggression. We moved to our analysis section with Joe looking through the ethical framework of 4 avenues as well as shareholder model, the ethical advantages of this purchase. Next, utilizing the SWOT methodology, I looked at the business case for this acquisition. And lastly, Casey looked at the legal ramifications as well as how to structure this acquisition. And we made the recommendation to go through with this acquisition. We feel that this presents us the opportunity to maximize shareholder wealth. At this time, we'd like to open it up for any questions, comments, or discussion points you may have for us.
Let me start by saying thank you very much. Very well done. And I hope that you don't take any of the questions or comments to be in a negative form. But you all did a very good presentation, and I really appreciated some of the contrast that you made in terms of the mitigation versus the opportunities and all. Having been in the corporate world, there was just one thing that jumped out at me, and I wanted to ask you. There was a direct recommendation that we acquire, and I want to know, did you look at the virtues of acquiring versus merger? In many instances, there are values to merging versus acquiring, and I'd like to hear your take on why you went so strong to the acquisition versus merger.
So one of the points that we looked at, which Casey touched upon, is the desire to keep the 2 brands separate. We feel that the branding value created by our Tiki Toy brand, which has been in existence for a long time with Zynga Toys, creates a lot of value just in it, being able to keep them separate. And
then secondly, also there was a really important issue that Jay touched upon too, of the problem of how frequently mergers fail, and primarily because of the culture clash between organizations, and these are two very different organizations. One is a more electronic, creative, R&D focused company, and the other is a more traditional toy company, and really would be a difficult cultural merge. And so by structuring it as an acquisition of a subsidiary and allowing their culture to remain more or less intact, but definitely putting our ethical stamp on it, that would allow that culture to maintain its vitality, its creativity, and not be kiboshed too much by a company with just a very different direction and approach. That was, we believe, an important consideration there.
So structurally, is your recommendation that in keeping it as a subsidiary, it maintain its original board of directors, and that we as the board of directors of Parent Tiki just essentially do a policy and procedure and enact an ethical standard upon this board and ask them to adopt it? Or are you suggesting that we share certain members of our board of directors onto the subsidiary so that we can attempt to enforce that cultural change on them? What would be your procedurally, how would you see that occurring?
We see that occurring as Zynga Games could essentially keep their board of directors and Tiki Toys gets seats on the board. So whether it be 2 or 3 seats, so that Tiki Toys does have a certain influence over the board, but so that the Zynga Games boards can maintain its culture and its creativity as it has. Because obviously Zynga Games has been a very successful company. It's just that we feel that we need our ethical stamp on it, and there needs to be a certain amount of watching over.
Right. It is important to have that influence in the corporate governance. I mean, to have
So the ethical stamp has to be negotiated at the time of the acquisition, as opposed to, relying upon a vote of the board of directors, because if we don't have enough members on the board, then they may not adopt the ethical standards of Tiki. Is that correct?
And as we get to know, if you get to know who the members of the board are, I mean, it may become necessary. I think that's part of through the negotiation process as you get to know that you may make the determination that it is necessary to completely change out the board. I mean, I think that's sort of a discussion, because this is going to be an ongoing discussion as you move toward closing the deal, and that may be possible. But we want to go into it being reluctant at first to completely change everything for them. But understanding that may be a possibility that's necessary.
I say, was there any analysis of what percentage of Zynga's titles or the revenue of their titles that didn't fit with our values that we would be looking to divest?
We feel that this opportunity gives us, with our standards in place, a significant enough revenue share where it is worthwhile the price that we're being asked to pay. We do also know that there's opportunities for us to sell off some of these brands that don't meet our criteria.
And there was one statistic that came up for us it's about 75% of video games that have violent content have this problem of this sort of moral equivalency of the same consequences for either morally questionable behavior and not. And so there are the majority of games can be rewritten in this way and still be the sort of exciting games that customers want to buy. But we're not advocating for making these games boring by any means. We're not going to try and sell sugar-free granola, but we are saying that it is possible to keep these games with the content it has, but make this very important connection between that there are negative consequences to negative behavior, because the games, in our opinion, need to reflect reality.
Was any consideration given to what Zynga's current value system or value structures, or I believe they're publicly traded as well, right? Is there anything that you evaluated to compare our value systems to see how far apart they are?
No, I mean it's a hypothetical company, so no, we didn't look into that specifically. But there are the video game makers out there that are real. It's based on real companies, of course. But games like the drug one.
Grand Theft Auto.
He's the game record. Grand Theft Auto. I mean, those are outliers, really. Those are the ones that are just not capable of being rewritten.
But are they not the high earners? I mean, my concern is that what we're looking at is the acquisition of a company where the majority of their high revenue games are the more violent.
So you do see, you have a very good observation there. You have a tendency to get higher publicity for these games that are rated M that do a lot of volume in their first few months upon release. But looking at the industry as a whole, one of the things that we actually found very interesting, it was in a study that didn't actually make our final presentation, but in terms of just volumes of revenues, it's actually your games that are rated T and under that do a much more significant volume.
T meaning?
Oh, 13 and, yep. So those games that are 18 plus, while there are a few individual titles that generate a lot of revenues, if you look at the aggregate, they are a smaller chunk of the pie than the games that we could be potentially selling.
Was there any thought given to, and I'll use your term, if we impose our values on Zynga and turn Grand Theft Auto into not sugar-free granola, but sugared granola, would we be expecting perhaps a talent train as those designers say, I don't want to work on little kids' games, and suddenly we have a gaming company with no designers?
We see that. There is a possibility of that, but we also see the opportunity to become the industry leader. As Sean pointed out, with the public opinion being that the games themselves are possibly more dangerous than the guns, that we could potentially actually get the reverse, where students that come out of college feel so strongly about this that they do want to work for our company.
Yeah, and also that's also a benefit of sort of keeping the separate brand for Zynga and the kids gaming division within Tiki Toys, is that we wouldn't need all of the developers. If there are developers that really don't want to have anything to do with making Disney video games, they don't have to. They can remain in their roles, primarily working on Zynga subsidiary games. But there are bound to be also developers existing within the company that are open to that and can over.
I'm having some trouble with the concept of the acquisition at all. The first question was whether we should acquire it, because it could be aligned with our values. And frankly, it seems to me there is no alignment possible between these games with Tiki Toys' values. And creating a wholly owned subsidiary only embraces the Zynga brand. You're talking about Zynga as having its own brand, its own values, but if we were to implement your process, we would divest ourselves of the titles, or reprogram the titles, or change everything that makes up Zynga as Zynga and destroy it, so that it would then conform to our brand. In other words, we might as well just go ahead and acquire it and Grand Theft Auto and EQ2 and Age of Conan and every game out there and valorize them by reprogramming, destroying, divesting the titles, taking them off the market so that people will play more Solitaire and Angry Birds. Is that what you're saying?
With regards to the very first point, Zynga is a diverse company. While we have chosen to emphasize on their more violent offerings, they do provide games that currently meet our child developmental needs. They have games that are rated E for everyone and E10 plus. So it's not all bad. Now, directly addressing the latter point, which you raised about having to rewrite these violent games to a point where it doesn't even make sense to have a separate acquisition, we're proposing not so much in terms of completely rewriting and destroying these games. We're talking about a sell-off in terms of games that are just impossible for us to salvage, such as the Grand Theft Auto, where even if you were to try your very best to tie negative consequences with negative actions, reducing the likelihood that your game player is going to have aggression problems, it's an unfavorable effort. You can't quite do it. It's not possible.
And we also feel that, talking what we talked about, where games that don't meet our criteria, we either divest or recode. We feel that the recoding almost makes it more realistic in that similar to real life, you do have negative consequences to negative actions. And we don't necessarily see that as really changing, other than, say, unlike Grand Theft Auto, where it is the point to violate every law that we've known, is to stick with games where you are the military officer in, say, the Call of Duty, where there are ramifications for doing things that are unethical. And we feel that this would actually add to the value of it.
Is fantasy in itself an unethical behavior because it takes the player into a world which they could not safely enter in real life? Is that unethical then for a player to enjoy, whether it's Grand Theft Auto or any other game, that they couldn't do in the real world, but they can do it on screen? And where do we get that line to separate between translating from TV video screen to the world? Frankly, I'm not sure I make the connection that you did between Sandy Hook and video games, but let's assume that that's the case. What causes those people to cross that line? And is it our ethical obligation to protect them?
Well, there's first of all the important thing to touch on with the shooters in Columbine and Sandy Hook and some of those is not only were they playing these video games, but they were very addicted to them, and also that they had these problems of the moral equivalency of actions within the game. So those are important things to touch on. But and it's still, the fact is it's an outstanding question as to what link for these particular individuals exposure to those games have. But I mean, it's our point here is that it's an opportunity for Tiki Toys to both grow as a business, but also provide ethical leadership in an industry that sorely needs it, really. And of course that it wouldn't be practical necessarily to touch on your earlier question to buy up all the games, because I think that's probably beyond the capabilities of Tiki Toys, but to start making a positive difference where there really isn't a leader within the industry making this kind of positive difference.
I think also to touch on your question about whether fantasy is ethical in the first place, is what we're offering is an ethical choice within fantasy. So these fantasy games are neither ethical nor unethical. It's the player gets to make those choices, and if they make unethical choices, then they suffer consequences for it within these games.
One other thing I forgot was we mentioned a Harvard study that looked at and accounting for other factors besides simply exposing to violent video games, and found that link to be weakened, the correlation between playing video games and having aggressive behavior was weakened. Another element to that same study was that they not only did they find this weaker link, but they found that the ability to act out one's very natural sort of aggressive tendencies or desires, much like somebody enjoying boxing, for example, it provides a channel, a safe channel for someone to have that kind of outlet. And with the numbers of people playing these sorts of games, and actually the average age of people playing these sorts of games is 33. The number of people playing it, they are able to make the distinction in life and be able to have this safe channel for these very natural.
So the average age of the people playing these games are the parents of the kids we're selling trucks to?
Well, it's the young adult meals is and typically single. Not always. But maybe their wives are more tolerant than they allow them to be.
My concern too about the proposed acquisition is that addiction is part of what keeps people there. And so from a business point of view, you want people addicted. You want people who are going to continue to play the game and continue to bring in more people. It's a little bit like asking the pharmaceutical companies to stop manufacturing things that people will be on for the rest of their lives. It's where the profit margin is.
Sure.
So it's a tough consideration whether or not to get involved in the video game.
But I think there can be a difference between something that appeals to someone, something that they want to keep coming back to, but not necessarily that they're compelled to. And so being able to at least mitigate it to the extent where there are fewer people having a real compulsion to like a neurochemical compulsion to keep coming back.
Can we touch briefly on this addiction thing?
Sure.
Quickly, not a violent game, just a non-violent game. Let's take solitaire. There's a video game, and there are probably people out there who may be addicted to playing solitaire on their iPad or their video games or whatever. And that addiction is manifested by them suddenly not coming to work or neglecting the kids or things like that. We don't know about that right now, but we may know about more in the future. If we acquire the company, do we take on that load so that when the lawsuits do come for addiction, we don't have this superior knowledge out there that already had advanced clues that this was addictive, and already we are doing the same thing in terms of video that Lilliard was doing with tobacco, creating and selling to people who are going to be addicted. Is that what Tiki Toys wants to do, or is that a question even to worry about?
Well, the 2 points, I think one of the things that we looked at is working with psychologists to figure out what causes addiction in video games, and then try to design our games to, I guess from a fiscal standpoint, it's a little bit of a fine line, but try to mitigate that in our designs. And we feel the key is not to necessarily hide the data, it's to share it with the community as a whole to make better for society.
Well,
Definitely.
I'm just going to touch briefly on kind of expand out what Stephen had mentioned, though, is that you're saying that if you acquire it as a separate subsidiary, you acquire the entire company, then at that point the liabilities will travel with it. So any past liabilities that they had are going to carry forward. Then if you bring on the psychologists and they confirm that there are addiction behaviors and behavioral issues, and you have that document, that you gain the superior knowledge, then you bought yourself a whole series of lawsuits for everything that existed prior, all of the previous video games. So that would be the analysis that I would want to have, is what are the legal liabilities that I could potentially have if I follow your recommendation, bring on the psychologist to try to deal with the addictive behaviors, have that documented in my files, and now I've got lawsuits from past activities. So is there anything that you would suggest or structure for the acquisition in order to deal with those potential liabilities?
I think that may be a bit beyond what we're really focusing on, but I think it is important.
Well, you brought up the idea of acquiring.
Well, exactly. I mean, if there are more than simply more legal ways and avenues for us to further limit liability, we would certainly explore that. But I think that it would play well in our favor to be able to demonstrate that we've in fact been making a very good faith effort to get to the bottom of things, and actually, because there is still a lack of knowledge about the addictiveness of games. We would in fact be helping to drive figuring out what that is. I think that would play well. I would hope that would play well on the lines of many juries if it were to get that far in a particular lawsuit. But in terms of things beyond the structure we propose, I'm not sure we really have anything specific. Would you?
I think it's a matter of doing due diligence without the knowledge of what causes these addicting behaviors. There's not really a way to figure out what the liability could be. And so it would be a matter of due diligence, a matter of estimating high and seeing if that high amount of lawsuits would still make this a valuable acquisition. So that's further analysis that we could do for the board to see if that would still be valuable.
I have one last question, and then I'd like to see if any of the other board members have one. This may be trying to close the barn after the horse is out, and we'll have to check with our legal folks to see if it's possible. But as our consultants to this, would you have a problem if there was any way that we could go about just totally getting away from using the word addiction? Because I think that use of the word addiction ties us to a significant amount of liabilities. Now, legal would have to tell us if we would be, going down a slippery slope to talk about just throwing your report out because it's in there now. But I want to know what your feeling is about us going away from the whole use of the word addiction.
I'd let you guys weigh in on it too, but I would personally be a little uncomfortable with it if, depending on how far away you get from the term addiction, because it is seen as a very real thing out there for video games. And I think certainly there's more legal research that can be done in terms of what potential legal liabilities are, but in terms of the opportunity to provide the ethical leadership in the industry, I think it would almost kneecap Tiki Toy's ethical opportunity to not straightforwardly tackle that issue.
In addition to that point, I think there's also a transparency issue that could potentially arise. The issue of addiction in video games of all kinds is something that the industry is trying to deal with. This is a heavily criticized industry for a variety of reasons. So getting back to Joe's ultimate point, it would only fetter our opportunities to demonstrate some leadership that this industry desperately needs.
I only asked the question because my colleague raised the question about the folks being addicted to playing blackjack or solitaire or whatever. If you were to listen to my wife, she'd say that you, and all the rest of us are addicted to these cell phones. So there's addiction, and then there's addiction, and I just think that it's a kind of slippery slope when we start to tag folks with being addicted. Anyone else?
One last question for you. As part of your recommendations was to acquire Zynga, get rid of the games that are, for lack of a better term, unredeemable. Say the Rambo shooting the surrendering person. But then you also have games like Angry Birds, which the pigs would argue is a violent game.
You people probably don't like throwing birds anyway.
How do we decide how much violence is too much violence? How do we draw that line?
Well, I think I'm not sure right away how to answer it, but one thing to mention, it was interesting with the Supreme Court case that you mentioned, that the justices, as they were going through oral argument, kept bringing up things like the Grimm's fairy tales being, before Walt Disney got a hold of them, were incredibly violent. And so really, violence is something that exists, and it's something that is a part of human reality, and has existed in the realm of fiction and fantasy for long before electricity was invented, much less video games. So I think that's one interesting sort of thing to note, at least, that it's been around. It is part of life.
In terms of where to draw the line, one of the actual subtleties of our recommendation was that divergence of game titles based on ratings. So the rating agency in charge of video games is the ESRB, and while they don't in effect have any real teeth, they're not going to impose fines or anything like that. They do evaluate games throughout their development stages to assess exactly your question: how much violence is too much violence? So they actually have categories of violence, and it's available information, public, on their website. So they have violence and gore, and they have something called fantasy violence. Now, fantasy violence is something you'd find on your Angry Birds, for example, or an E for Everyone game. And it is violence, but it's to a much lesser extent. There isn't any blood or any shootings of drug dealers like in Grand Theft Auto or any of those unredeemable games.
Okay, well, thank you very much. That was very informative, and I'm a little scared of you. You know way too much. And everyone else drew a blank when it came to Grand Theft Auto. That was very informative, and I think you all did an outstanding job. Let me right now just see if there's anyone we need to clear the room of. If there's anyone here who's a spectator that's associated with another team, we would ask you to leave now so that we can do our feedback and all. But if you are not associated with any other team, you are welcome to stay. I think we only have one person who's not associated with any teams, and the rest are judges. All right. I think your presentation style was very, very good. There was a very seamless handoff of the different parts that each of you handled. Again, I really like how you all tied together things like mitigation and opportunities and prudence and respect. You kind of gave a yin and a yang for these things, and you did a really good job of continuing to go back to what was the ethical aspect. You drew very clear and concise lines between what was your ethical, your business, and legal perspective. And personal like of mine is I like you referring to the business piece as opposed to financial. So there was just something that was a little more appealing to me to call it the business as opposed to the financial. Those are my comments.
Very well done, very informative, and well coordinated among the four of you. It felt like a very nice close. Of a small question. Did you coordinate wardrobes? Because it works perfectly.
It was actually more coordinated. We were all going to wear purple, which is the color of
we
school.
tried to
Guys,
coordinate,
stop.
and
Good. I thought that might be part of the school color.
I got you covered, guys.
Well done.
Well, I thought you guys did an exceptional job. What I liked was you started with the ethical piece, too, and that theme carried through, even when you touched on the various subjects. But the interaction and the handoffs between all of you guys were excellent and seamless. Everybody contributed taking the piece, but you all tied it all through the ethical side, which I really thought you did very well. Very job well done.
thank you.
All right. I like the fact that you took the controversial position, which is go for it, acquire, even though pieces of this business do not fit your model already. I'm glad you took that because it challenged me to take it one step further and say, okay, these guys they're not taking the easy road and telling me to pack them up and leave. They're telling me go for it, and here's our solution on how to deal with tricky stuff. So I like that a lot. A couple comments. When you're giving your analysis on, let me go back. Another thing that I liked is that you didn't talk down to me. You didn't oversimplify it for me. I felt like I was getting a presentation from professionals in an industry that were coming to me and speaking to me as though I had already done my homework and I already had some basic level of knowledge, well, not basic, a little bit above and beyond what the basic industry was going to be in. So thank you for talking it up to me. But on that same point, when you bring up things such as interests, duties, rights, virtues, as well as the areas of prudence and respect, when you talked about those concepts, it would have been better if you would have been able to give me some real-life examples, maybe some other industry examples of that, so that I can equate those business terms to things that are happening within my business or my competitor's business. As far as the levels of violence within and your discussion of the levels of violence within videos, instead of bringing up that in the Q&A, bring it up in the presentation because it's an important piece, that understanding that. And then tell me how many of the video games are in the high level of violence and how much are in the lower level of violence. Even if it's a theoretical company, I still would like to know that so I know what the divestiture is going to be later on. As far as the legal acquisition goes, I'm going to answer my own question. One of the things that you can do is you can say, well, escrow funds from the acquisition and put it on the side and only release certain levels of those funds from the purchase price until after the statute of limitations has run on the rest of them. And then that way there, you have funds that are sitting on the side that are there to defend legal claims. You also want to make sure that the insurance is transferable from the original company over into, and so that there's no issues with the insurance coverage and making sure that that's there available to deal with any liability issues. Okay, and then the last thing is, eviction doesn't necessarily have to be a bad word. For example, you all went to school and somebody in the back of the classroom was always reading a book. That person is addicted to reading books. They probably weren't even paying attention to what was going on, but they read the material and they studied and learned better through addiction. It's a form of entertainment for them, no different than a video game, but they were addicted to reading books. It doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. Certain people are more prone to be addicted to doing certain things. So you can also identify that as being beneficial, not just a bad thing, okay?
Yeah. Go ahead. That was a very polished presentation. That you did a very good job. If I had one complaint, it would be you had a slide about the international standards, and then international kind of went away.
Okay.
I was, if people are just like, oh, we're going to talk about international, and then it just disappeared. I was sad. So, if we're talking about an international merger of an international company, it would be nice to have a little more of the international piece. Having said that, I was very impressed by the way that it wasn't, we weren't being beat over the head with this is the way you do it, this is the ethical way. You presented contrasting studies, contrasting opinions, which was helpful to help us think through the position we were taking. So I appreciate that a lot. Overall, a really good presentation. Thank you.
I was very impressed with your presentation skills. Polish is outstanding what you did. Very nice stuff. I think that you need to carry that presentational skill set into the Q&A. There were just a couple of times in there where you broke role and you started responding as St. Thomas students as opposed to the consultants, right? He's our gamer, or whatever. Be the professional consulting company all the way through, even when we're asking questions that tax you. That said, I thought you showed additional knowledge of your subject matter. You really were subject matter experts by handling the questions, and that was very good. If someone were to say, after you incorporated Anthony's suggestion, well, that's too much on the legal part, be sure to tie these kinds of things back to the ethical part, because holding those escrow funds out in acquisition is meeting our ethical standards as tiki toys. We want to impose our will on this wholly owned subsidiary, and we don't have the board positions to cast the votes, and we can't actually make them do it, but we can build in those consequences just like we want them to do in the games, and that tunes into our ethical position saying we want to do the right thing. So I think you can actually have your cake to...
Yeah, when there's a purchase between two companies, an acquisition, both of them get to make the decision. So you may want to be the buyer, but they may be an unwilling seller if they know that these are the consequences of their action, of the purchase.
I just wanted to add one more thing about if you're making this presentation in the future. There's a whole school of thought around gaming can solve a lot of the environmental and urban issues. There's a woman who does a TED Talk who's a gamer who actually flips this story completely. And if you were making a presentation to sell a company on acquiring, you really want to have part of that built into your story.
address that and segue in. And one way you might want to address that is by saying, not taking the acquisition has nothing to do with ethics. That's just not getting involved. And that's not the way Tiki Toys works. Because somebody else is already running out the games. The games are out there. Right? The question is, do we want to make an impact as leaders in the video world or opening up video world by acquiring them and then providing insurrection? And yes, we want to recommend that. And there you take your bold and potentially controversial stance and sell it and wipe away the expectation that people are going to want to say, oh, well, we shouldn't even touch this.
Do you think we should tie that into the 2 points we made with dealing with addiction and aggression? When we talk about trying to take the leadership role by proactively doing that, but we made no mention of making the acquisition the key point for doing that.
Well, I think you should tie it in, yes.
Yeah.
And so that would be a good place.
I really like, the idea of touching on not taking the acquisition is just refusing to play.
Any further questions or comments you'd like to make?
No.
With that, I'd like to say you all did a wonderful job.